Welcome to Take a Breath, a podcast for creating practical calm in the messy middle of midlife. I'm Polly, and this is your space to pause. Because life in midlife is full on, between work, family, menopause, and the mental load, your nervous system can easily end up in constant overdrive, leaving you feeling exhausted, reactive, and overwhelmed by even the smallest things. Each week, I'll share my own tools alongside honest conversations and practical nervous system support to help you create more calm, peace, joy, and inner steadiness. So whenever you're ready, let's take a breath in through the nose, feel your belly rise, your ribs expand, and as you exhale, let's begin. Hello, and welcome back to Take a Breath. Now, today I am talking about anxiety. Now, anxiety is something I've experienced, people I love have experienced, and also many people that I work with experience. And I'm sure that maybe it's something that you have experienced as well. Before I start, I just want to say that what I'm going to talk about today comes from my own lived experience with anxiety, as well as my work with many others, as well as also reading loads of books on the subject and many of the courses I've taken. And I really do hope that what I'm going to share with you can give you a different perspective on anxiety. But just I want to give you a disclaimer here. I'm not a psychotherapist or a doctor. So if you are experiencing extreme anxiety or having intrusive and disturbing thoughts, please do go and see your GP or a psychotherapist, because sometimes that is what you need. And I do think there is a place sometimes for medication. It can be a really helpful route to help you through it. It's not necessarily a long-term solution, but it can be another important tool in that moment to help you find the solutions. So I just wanted to say that before we get cracking. I also just want to say I have spoken about anxiety in previous episodes of this podcast in one of its iterations before, but I realised recently that I've learned so much more about anxiety over the last few years. And if I had recorded this episode a few years ago, it probably sounded very different to what I'm going to talk about now. Because back then I did think that anxiety was something that we needed to fix, something that we had to overcome, something to stop. But now I see it actually very differently. And I honestly think understanding this has been one of the biggest shifts in my own life and the ones who I work with. So today I want to share that with you. But first, I just want to take you back a few years to when I was in the thick of perimenopause. Now, if you'd known me before then, I really wouldn't have described myself as an anxious person. Of course, I've had moments of stress like everybody does, but, I wasn't really an anxious person. I'd worry from things time to time like everybody else does, but I wasn't someone who lived with anxiety, or at least I didn't think I was. Then something started to change. And at first it was very, very subtle. I almost didn't notice it. But I remember driving on the motorway one day, and I've always felt comfortable driving on the motorway. I used to drive from Bristol to Edinburgh, from where I used to live to where I was at university multiple times. Never thought twice about it. And then suddenly, in my 40s, I remember driving on the motorway, and I got this terrible feeling in my chest. My heart was racing, like the sweatiest hands on the steering wheel, and just this rush in my body. And I kind of remember thinking, my God, what's going on? What's happening? And then the thoughts started of panic, of, my gosh, I'm driving this bit of metal at this really high speed along this piece of road with lots of other bits of metal. And what if I just accidentally turned the steering wheel this way or that way? And all these thoughts were coming in my head of, which really scared me. What if something happens? What if I do something and I cause an accident? Or what if someone else does? But the thing was, nothing had happened. Nothing had changed to what I'd normally done. I was driving on a motorway that I'd driven on loads of times before, but suddenly my body was reacting as if I wasn't safe. And that was sort of one of the things that started. At the same sort of time, my goodness, the worry about my family massively kicked in. And I don't know whether you can relate to this, but my mind became incredibly good at imagining everything that could possibly go wrong if one of them didn't answer their phone. My mind filled the blanks. I imagined the worst. There was this one really embarrassing time, I think I have spoken about this before, where my husband was at his work Christmas party, and he had told me that that's what he was going to do this one evening during the week, but I had completely forgotten about it, or I hadn't heard him properly. So when he didn't come home at the usual time I was expecting him, I had made dinner, all the things. Oh, I just went into this panic mode, and it got so bad that I ended up I remember I ended up trying to track down, phoned people in his office. I'd been finding their numbers, befriended them on Facebook to try and find out where they were, wondering when Giles had left the office. And I went into such a panic mode. I was visualizing him beaten up in an alley in London. I almost started phoning up hospitals. It got so bad. And honestly, I when I look back to that, it was like, wow, my mind went to places I didn't think it could go. And then he phoned me after he saw he had about 5,000 missed calls because he was in a basement restaurant. He hadn't received any of them. And he's like, what's wrong? And I was like, my God, you're still alive. But the weird thing is, I couldn't quite believe that was me. I was wondering, what on earth is wrong with me? Why suddenly am I becoming this person who's feeling incredibly anxious? And I know so many of you listening have probably asked yourselves those exact same questions, because from the outside, I know that I still look like I had it all together. I was running my business. I was looking after my family. I was doing all the things. Nobody would have looked at me and thought, okay, she's struggling, she's anxious. But inside, it felt like my nervous system was permanently in this high alert state. Like I could never quite fully exhale my breath. Like I was always waiting for the next thing to happen. And because I'm someone who naturally likes to understand things, I did what I generally always do. I started researching, reading, learning, training, trying to understand what was going on. And at first, I learned all the usual things about anxiety, about mindset, about thoughts and how you can change your thoughts and be more positive. And don't get me wrong, all of that was incredibly helpful. But there was still something that was missing. And it wasn't really until I started learning about the nervous system in depth on the course I did with the brilliant Martin McPhillany in the School of Breast Science that it all started to kind of make much more sense to me. So I learned about interoception, about how our brain is constantly trying to predict what's going to happen next. And I added all of that to my earlier learning and training about perimenopause, that suddenly it's like, oh, I get it now. I realized something that completely changed the way I saw anxiety. And I started kind of thinking, okay, what if we ask ourselves, what if anxiety actually itself wasn't the problem? What actually, if anxiety wasn't my body working against me? What actually, if anxiety is trying to protect me? What if actually this is something which is good for, it's got my best interest at heart? And actually that really that approach changed everything. Because instead of kind of constantly wondering, how on earth do I get rid of this? I need to get rid of this. I started getting curious and thinking, okay, what actually instead is my body trying to tell me? So instead of fighting it, I became curious. I stopped trying to silence it and actually instead started to listen. And that's exactly what I want to share with you in this episode, because if you're in perimenopause or even if you're postmenopausal and you've found yourself worrying more, feeling more overwhelmed, finding it harder to switch off, or doing that awful thing of lying awake at 3 a.m. with your mind racing, it's not because you're suddenly becoming an anxious person. Your body's just operating under very different conditions than it was before, than it was, 10 years ago. And once you understand that, it really does help to make so much more sense of actually what's going on. So let's talk about that. So going back to me driving on the motorway, what's actually really fascinating is that, as I said, it wasn't the motorway that changed. Nothing had really changed. It was simply my nervous system's prediction of what the motorway meant. And once I understood that and started sending my body repeated signals of safety through different methods, so mainly through understanding what was going on internally by training my breath, and understanding myself better and sending signals of safety to my body, that fear gradually lost its grip. So I didn't force myself to be fearless. I taught my nervous system that the motorway wasn't a really terrible, dangerous place, a place of, which needed to send all those alarm bells ringing. So let's just start by changing one of the biggest, I think, misconceptions about anxiety, because I think this is one of the reasons so many of us end up feeling so frightened by it. We've been taught to think of anxiety as something that has gone wrong in us, as if the anxiety itself is the problem. But actually, let's just look at it. What if anxiety is simply your body's way of saying, okay, I'm here because I'm trying to keep you safe. Most of us think our brain reacts to what's happening, but actually the latest neuroscience suggests something a bit different to that. Our brain is actually constantly making predictions. It's almost like trying to stay one step ahead of everything. So rather than waiting to see what happens, it's asking, okay, based on everything that we've experienced before, what do we think is about to happen? And I absolutely love this because it explains so much. Okay, if you just think about your predictive text on your phone, if you always type the same phrase, say, eventually your phone starts suggesting it before you've even finished typing, and your brain does something really similar to that, except instead of predicting words, it starts predicting experiences. So it's taking everything you've ever lived through, everything you've ever learned, everything you've repeated. So every stressful experience, every difficult conversation, every bit of overwhelm, every time you've held everything together or you've pushed through the exhaustion, or every time you've ignored what your body's actually asking for, it's just simply quietly in the background building a picture of the world that you are living in. It's constantly learning, it's adapting, not because it's trying to make your life difficult, but because its prediction is incredibly efficient. So if you imagine if every single morning your brain had to learn from scratch that brushing your teeth was safe, my goodness, it would just not get anything done. If every time you had to make a cup of tea, it had to relearn or whatever it was. So instead, the brain predicts, and that's usually incredibly helpful. It really saves us a lot of energy until, of course, it starts predicting danger where there isn't any. So going back to the motorway, nothing had changed. The motorway hadn't suddenly become more dangerous. I hadn't forgotten how to drive, and I wasn't actually in danger, but my body was behaving as though I was. Why? Because somewhere along the line, my nervous system had started predicting that driving on the motorway might not be safe anymore. And it wasn't a conscious thing, this. I wasn't there just thinking, okay, this motorway is really dangerous. My body got there first. So I felt in my I felt that heart racing, the sweaty hands, my breathing would have changed as well. And then my mind did what minds are just brilliant at doing. It started trying to explain those sensations, because how we feel is connected with what we think. So it is like a loop. So I started kind of trying to explain those sensations in my body and then I'd start thinking, okay, what if something happens? What if something terrible happens? So can you see how different that feels? The thoughts weren't necessarily creating the anxiety. The thoughts were trying to explain what my body was already experiencing. And that's a really important distinction, because so often we blame ourselves for thinking negatively. We think, if only I could stop these thoughts. But your mind is doing exactly what it's evolved to do. It's trying to make sense of what your body is feeling. There's a brilliant little book, which I've talked about before, which I absolutely love. It's by an author called Joseph. I never know how to say his surname. Joseph Nguyen. It's Nguyen. And his book's called Don't Believe Everything You Think. It's a really short little book. I mean, it's only a couple of hours on audiobook. I've given it to my children. I've given it to friends. It's a brilliant book, and it talks really beautifully about this. So he reminds us that our thoughts aren't facts. They are just mental events. Our mind generates thousands of thoughts every single day, and most of them simply come and go. The difficulty begins when we automatically believe every single one of them. So just because your mind says, okay, something terrible might happen, it doesn't mean something terrible is about to happen. Your mind's job isn't to tell the future. Its job is to imagine possibilities. And sometimes it's really helpful ones, but sometimes it can be quite frightening ones. But they're still possibilities. They are not certainties. And I think this is incredibly freeing, because it means, we don't have to argue with every anxious thought. We don't have to prove them wrong. We can simply notice them. Go, oh, okay, there we go. There's my mind trying to keep me safe again. There it's trying to protect me. And that just feels a little gentler, doesn't it? So instead of saying, what's wrong with me? We can just start saying, okay, thank you, body. I know you're trying to help. And it doesn't mean that we're just going to stay anxious forever. We're not. Because if your body has learned to predict danger, the brilliant thing about our brain is that it can learn something new. Your nervous system, none of this is fixed. It's adaptable. It's constantly updating its predictions based on what it experiences repeatedly. And the important word here is repeatedly. So it's not once or occasionally, it's repeatedly. This is why often, one relaxing weekend can't undo years of stress. It's why one breath work, meditation doesn't suddenly change everything and going to erase your anxiety forever. It's because your nervous system is asking, what happens most of the time? What's familiar? And if what's familiar has been tension, holding your breath, rushing, overthinking, that's what your nervous system begins to expect. Not because you've done anything wrong, because familiarity equals safety to the brain. And at the end of the day, what our nervous system is craving is safety, is to feel safe. That is what we're looking for. I will only ever recommend brands that I know, love and use myself. And one of those is Ancient and Brave. Honestly, they've become part of my daily habits. The very first thing I do every morning is pour myself a big glass of water with their True Hydration in it. It feels like such a simple ritual, but it really sets me up for the day. And I know I'm properly rehydrating with their blend of electrolytes and minerals, especially before I exercise, which I always do in the morning. Then later on, when I make my coffee, I stir in their true collagen powder into the coffee. Now, it blends in straight away, no fuss, there's no taste, and collagen is something we naturally lose as we age, but it's so important for our skin, joints, and overall vitality. Now, I'll be honest, Ancient and Brave may cost a little more than some of the tubs you'll spot on supermarket shelves, but the difference is you're getting the highest quality ingredients, sourced with integrity and tested to a higher standard, and absolutely no nasties added. That's why I trust them and why I think they're worth every penny. And because I want you to be able to try them out for yourself, I've got a special offer for you. As a listener of this podcast, you can get 20% off your very first order. All you need to do is click the link in the show notes and pop in the code POLYW20 at checkout. They've got more than just collagen and hydration too. They've got creatine, they've got blends, supplements. So it's a perfect chance to explore their range and make the most of that 20% off. Your anxiety is evidence that your nervous system has been working incredibly hard to protect you. And the brilliant news is that if your nervous system learned protection through lots of repeated experiences, it can also learn safety through lots of repeated experiences. So let's just bring in perimenopause and menopause now, because if you've listened to my recent episode, it was called The Missing Piece in the Perimenopause Conversation, you'll know I spoke about something I think is missing from so many conversations around menopause. You know, we hear a lot about the hormone side of it and then the hot flushes and the weight gain and the brain fog, but we don't, I believe, hear nearly enough about what those hormonal changes are doing to our nervous system. And for me, this is the missing piece. So just a quick recap, if you haven't listened to that episode, estrogen doesn't just influence our reproductive system. It's got receptors throughout our whole body, through the brain and the nervous system, and plays a really important part in how we regulate stress, how we process our emotions, how we sleep, focus, recover. So as our estrogen fluctuates during perimenopause, it's not just the hormones that change, it's the environment our nervous system is operating within that changes too. So imagine you've spent your whole life driving a car with really good shock absorbers. The road hasn't always been smooth, but your car absorbed all the bumps really nicely. And then those shock absorbers begin to wear out. And that is basically what happens in perimenopause. Suddenly you feel every pothole, every bump, every patch of uneven road. The road itself hasn't changed, but your car has. And I think that's exactly what happens during perimenopause. You know, life hasn't suddenly become more stressful, although midlife is a stressful time of life. You know, there's a lot to juggle. As we know, there's that mental load, but your body experiencing that life has changed. So that's what makes life feel a little harder. So one way to think about this is through something called buffering capacity. So imagine your nervous system as a sponge, say. So when there's plenty of capacity in your nervous system, it's like a sponge. It can absorb the stresses from life and recover really easily. There's loads of space. But during perimenopause, that sponge fills much, much more quickly. It reaches its capacity sooner. And once it's full, even the small things can drip out, can tip over. And that can be the smallest things, from someone sitting next to you chewing a little loudly, or just sort of a background noise. And then suddenly, before you know it, you've snapped, you're in tears. Not because you are failing at anything, but because your nervous system has less capacity than it used to. And that's when we just don't feel like ourselves anymore. We just notice that we're feeling more irritable. It is not a good feeling. That, you know, we really do hear a lot, don't we? I just don't feel myself anymore at perimenopause. These are real biological changes. You're not imagining it. Perimenopause, though, doesn't suddenly create anxiety. I really do think it's more, it reveals how much your nervous system has been compensating for over many years. That buffering capacity has gone. As women, we are bloody amazing at holding all together, doing everything for everybody else. And we're quite good as well at overriding our own needs, pushing through our tiredness, putting everyone else first, ignoring our own body's signals. And your nervous system has to kind of carry that until one day it just can't anymore. It can't compensate in the same way. Your nervous system becomes more stress sensitive as this buffering capacity becomes smaller. So the same amount of pressure suddenly just feels so much bigger. And this is something which I experienced firsthand. I was so snappy, not coping. It was a lot because I just felt I had no space for anything anymore. So if anxiety is trying to protect us, why does it sometimes seem to take over our lives? Why doesn't it simply just disappear once the stressful moment has passed? And why do some of us seem to get caught in this cycle where we feel anxious about feeling anxious? And I think that's the big problem. We start to really fear the anxiety. And why on earth has my nervous system learned that anxiety is actually the safest option? Now, that might sound like a really strange thing to say, because none of us enjoy feeling anxious. It's uncomfortable, it's exhausting, and actually sometimes it can be really, really frightening. So why on earth would our nervous system keep choosing it? So one idea that I really like comes from psychotherapist Owen O'Kane. He talks about how we can almost become addicted to anxiety in his book, which is actually called Addicted to Anxiety. In his book, he's not saying we're addicted because anxiety feels good. He's saying that we just become really familiar with it. And our nervous systems love familiarity, not because it's always healthy, but because it feels predictable. So it's about this predictability again. So if you think about it, it makes sense. You know, if you spent years living at full speed, doing all the things, organizing, anticipating, trying to stay one step ahead, carrying all the responsibility, then your nervous system starts recognizing that state as normal. Okay. Your body becomes incredibly good at constantly scanning for danger, for checking, preparing, for always looking around the next corner, because somewhere along the line it's learned that staying alert has helped you cope. And maybe it did. Maybe being organized kept everything running. Maybe being the dependable one has become part of who you are. And, you know, we're so good at constantly sometimes thinking ahead, just because sometimes it's helped us survive some really difficult times of our life. And your nervous system isn't judging whether those strategies are good or bad. It's simply learning, oh, okay, this is how we stayed safe. So let's do that again. Let's repeat that. The problem comes when that strategy just never switches off. And it's often in those moments when actually everything should be great. So it might be when you're on holiday or at the end of the day when you're trying to relax and you can't switch off. You know that you want to relax, but your mind is still searching for the next problem, and you almost feel guilty for sitting still. It's almost as though your nervous system doesn't quite know what to do with that stillness, with that peace. I can still feel like that sometimes, but I've definitely got better at it. So instead of, having a really lovely quiet moment, instead of enjoying it, I'd immediately start thinking about what needs doing next, or worrying about something that hadn't even happened. We're not able to relax. We're constantly rehearsing problems because that's what our nervous systems have become so brilliant at doing. And I think that's really important, because when we understand that our nervous system has become brilliant at trying to rehearse problems and keep us safe, actually, we can stop making anxiety part of our identity. So instead of saying, oh, I'm just an anxious person, can we instead just kind of say, okay, My nervous system has just become really brilliant at anticipating danger. It's so well practiced at anticipating danger. This is a really different, it's subtle, but a different perspective on it. It kind of doesn't feel fixed anymore. It feels like it can be changeable. And that links also with going back to Joseph Nguyen in his book, Don't Believe Everything You Think. One of the ideas he shares is that our suffering doesn't actually come from life itself. It often comes from the stories we create in our minds about what is going on. So let's just be clear about this. He's not saying difficult things don't happen. They absolutely do. People get ill, relationships end, we lose people we love. Life can be incredibly painful, but there's a difference between experiencing pain and continuously creating suffering by getting caught in every fearful prediction our mind produces. So let me just give you an example. So imagine you're lying awake, a common scenario, at 3:00 in the morning. You wake up and your mind says to yourself, what if I don't get back to sleep? And that's obviously perfectly understandable. But then almost instantly, another thought comes, something like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be so tired tomorrow if I can't get back to sleep. And then another like, oh, I'm not going to cope with that meeting I've got. And then another one might come about, everyone's going to see how tired I am, and then I'll mess everything up. And within a few minutes, your body then starts to respond as though all those things are actually happening, whereas actually nothing's happened at all. You're still lying in your bed, but your nervous system is responding to that future that only exists in your imagination. So that is predictive thinking. Our mind is trying to protect us by running simulations, trying to solve problems before they exist. And again, all it's trying to do is trying to help. It's asking, what if this happens? So the difficulty comes when we mistake those predictions for our reality. And Joseph Nguyen reminds us, thoughts are just thoughts. They're not instructions. They're not facts. They are simply possibility. Our mind produces thousands and thousands of thoughts every day, and many of them are very useful. And some are completely and utterly random. Some do protect us, but some are very inaccurate. We don't want to believe every single one. I find that really incredibly freeing myself, because I realized I didn't have to argue with every anxious thought. I didn't have to prove it wrong, and I didn't have to force myself to think positively. I could just simply notice them. Okay, there's my mind again. It's trying to protect me, and that's okay. And that's just a much easier way to look at it. So we're not trying to fix anything. This is simply awareness. And just to add, I think where so many of us accidentally keep anxiety alive and well is because we become so frightened of the anxiety itself. I know this to be true. I know this to be true for many people. We notice perhaps those feelings in our body, that rush of in your body, your heart beating faster, the sweaty palms, and immediately we think, oh my God, here it is. Why am I so anxious? I need to calm myself down. This shouldn't be happening. What's wrong with me? And our body then notices, oh, there she goes again. She's frightened of this feeling. And then what does your nervous system conclude? Okay, this feeling must be dangerous. So it increases the alarm. So we get stuck in this trap. We're not only anxious about whatever triggered us, we're anxious about being anxious. It's almost like you're standing in front of a smoke alarm, waving a tea towel at it, shouting, stop making that noise. The alarm's not thinking, oh, okay then. It thinks, oh my goodness, there must be more smoke. There must be even more smoke. Keep going, keep sounding the alarm. And your nervous system does something similar. The more we resist, the more we fight it, we judge it, or we try and get rid of it, the more our body receives the message that anxiety itself is something to fear. So what we've got to try and do is, instead of saying, okay, go away, we start saying, okay, hi, anxiety. We meet it. Say to it, okay, I know you're here. I know you're trying to protect me. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. But I've got this. And I know this sounds so strange, but actually it really works. Think about how you'd respond to a frightened child. You wouldn't shout at them. You certainly wouldn't criticize them for being scared. You'd probably kneel down, soften your voice. You'd help them to feel safe. And that's exactly what your nervous system needs to. Not more criticism, not more pressure, not another reason to believe that something is wrong. It just needs repeated experiences of safety. Because remember what we've been talking about throughout this whole episode, your nervous system, it doesn't speak the language of logic, it speaks the language of experience. And every single time you meet anxiety with curiosity and kindness instead of criticism or control, you're gently teaching your nervous system something new. You're showing it that this moment doesn't have to become another emergency. You're helping it to make a different prediction next time. And that is where real change begins, not by fighting the anxiety, but by changing your relationship with it. Because once your relationship changes, everything else begins to change too. The more we resist anxiety, the more our nervous system assumes that there must be something dangerous happening. So imagine somebody, for example, knocking on your front door and you're like, oh my gosh, what's that? You're feeling really anxious. You pull the curtains closed, you turn all the lights off, pretend nobody's home, and that person keeps knocking. That can make you, it just stays there. That anxiety stays there. But instead, what happens if you walk to the door, you open it, you see who's there, then everything changes. You kind of like, you know what's going on. I think anxiety is a little bit like that. The first thing we need to do is stop pretending it isn't there. Not because we want to stay anxious, because we can't change what we're unwilling to meet. And this is where something called interoception comes in. Interoception, again, I've talked about this before. It's your ability to notice what's happening inside your own body. It's your inner awareness. It's how you know if you're hungry or thirsty, but it's also how you know your heart is racing, or if your shoulders are tense, or how you're breathing, or that it's the feelings in your body. It's your body's internal language. But the problem is that most of us have become really, really good at ignoring it, especially as women. We've spent so many years overriding our bodies, thinking, okay, I'm too busy, or I'll eat later, or I'll deal with that later, until eventually we stop noticing it altogether. So one of the things I teach a lot in pretty much every breathwork session I ever do with every client the first thing isn't breathing. It's actually noticing what is going on in the body, because awareness always becomes before any sort of change can happen. If you don't notice how perhaps you're holding your breath, when, there's something amazingly called email apnea. People often do it, hold their breath, for example, before they send an email, or when they are feeling a bit anxious. If you're not aware that you're doing it, how can you possibly change it? If you don't notice how tense your shoulders are, how can you let them drop? And so one of the things which we all tend to have if you're a bit anxious is really tense jaw. We clench our jaws, but it's about noticing so that we can release. Awareness really is wisdom. It's your body saying, okay, I'd like to pay attention now. So maybe try this. The next time you notice yourself feeling anxiety, rather than asking yourself, oh God, why am I so anxious? Maybe try just saying to yourself, okay, what am I noticing? Try and avoid saying why and instead use what, because why immediately sends us into the story of it, whereas what brings us back into our body. So what am I noticing? So maybe it is a tight chest, or maybe it's like a fluttery feeling in your tummy. It might be tension in your neck. It might be a racing heart. Just simply notice it without trying to change it, without judging it, just observing. So you might think, okay, my breath feels fast, or my shoulders are interesting. Okay, that's interesting. Curiosity really does change everything. It's the opposite to judgment. Judgment sort of closes us down, whereas curiosity opens us up. And it really is, it kind of gives us a sense of kindness, because curiosity says, okay, I'm willing to understand what's going on, instead of like, okay, I'm going to fix you. So once you've noticed what's happening, the next step really is giving yourself some love and compassion. And I know self-compassion is one of those phrases that you might hear quite a lot of. And I don't necessarily mean, standing in the mirror saying affirmations that you don't really truly believe. What I mean is just speaking to yourself the way you would speak to somebody you deeply love. Okay, think about that frightened child we talked about earlier, or perhaps one of your own children. If they come to you feeling anxious, what would you say? So just speak to yourself in a way that is calm, which is nice, which is loving. I've got you. You're safe. We'll get through this together. And just speak to that in a nice way. So that's when also using your breath becomes really powerful. So we're not talking about controlling your breathing. It's about communicating with your nervous system. Your nervous system, remember, doesn't speak English. It really responds to signals. And I really do think your breathing is like a remote control to your nervous system. It doesn't really respond so well to our thoughts. It responds to what we're experiencing. So again, breathing gently through the nose, long, slow exhales, softening the jaw, relaxing the shoulders. You're sending an important message to your nervous system. Okay, we're safe. Not because we're trying to convince ourselves, but because we're showing our body. So that's why I always encourage soft, gentle breathing, not forcing, not stimulating in these moments. It's about just gentle, slow, expansive nasal breaths. So it's almost as though you're allowing your breath rather than making it happen. And this is really amazing to help create space in the body, space in the mind, space between the feeling that you've got and the reaction that you automatically go to. Because when we create even the tiniest bit of space, that is when choice appears. So instead of automatically reacting, that's when we can respond. Instead of believing every thought we're getting, we simply can start to notice it. We can start to pause. We can start to soften. Okay, so it's not about necessarily becoming a different person. It's just about returning to who you've always been underneath all the protection that anxiety has given you. Okay. And remember, your nervous system, as I've talked about throughout the whole episode, it learns through repetition, not being perfect. It's about repetition. Every time you practice a gentle type of breath flow, you're not trying to become calmer in that moment, although often you do. You're teaching your nervous system something so much more important. You're teaching it a new normal, a new prediction, a new experience, one where it doesn't always have to prepare for the worst case scenario, one where safety becomes familiar, one where your body starts slowly trusting that it doesn't have to stay permanently in full on high alert mode. And this is not about never feeling anxious again. I still feel anxious. You still will feel anxious too. We're all human. The difference now is that anxiety no longer feels like an enemy that I've got to fight. It's just information. It's simply information. It's like a little chap on the shoulder from my body saying, okay, right, something needs your attention. And the trick is it's about noticing that. What is it? What is it you need? Sometimes it might be that you need to rest. It might be a boundary that needs to be put in place. It might be that you need to go and speak to a good friend. It might be that you just got to get up and get outside. And sometimes it might be that you just need 5 minutes of breathing slowly and reminding yourself that you are safe. And just reminding yourself that, okay, I'm fine, I'm okay. And sometimes that is enough. And every time we respond to our anxiety in a way that is kind and calming and giving it space, then we're strengthening that trust with ourselves, trust that our body isn't working against us, trust that we know how to respond, trust that we know how to come back to ourselves again. And ultimately, that is when we reach a sense of harmony. And when I say harmony, that's not a life without stress or anxiety, but a life where you know and you can trust that you can meet it and that you can come back to yourself. So just to reiterate, I don't think your goal should be to never feel anxious again, because, as I said, anxiety is part of being human. We all feel anxious sometimes. If you're about to go on a stage, it can be a good thing. You turn it into that kind of positive energy. We're going to feel anxious. Of course, that's your body doing exactly what it's designed to do. So it's not about eliminating anxiety. The goal is something much gentler, to change your relationship with it, to stop seeing anxiety as the enemy and instead begin seeing it as a messenger, as a signal, a little tap on the shoulder from your nervous system saying, okay, I need you, not that you're failing. It's just like, okay, I need you. Can you pay attention for a moment? Because once we stop fighting ourselves, we begin listening. And often our body's been trying to tell us the truth for a really, really, really long time. And perhaps for the first time in a very long time, we can start to hear it. I think one of the saddest things about modern life is that so many of us have just become incredibly good at just ignoring ourselves. We become brilliant at noticing everybody else's needs and not our own. So this is an invitation to just tune in, to notice, to be calm, to build that awareness. So next time you notice yourself feeling a little bit anxious or overwhelmed or even irritated, before you do anything else, simply pause, take one gentle breath in through your nose, a slow, soft breath out, let your shoulders soften, just unclench your jaw and just ask yourself, what is my nervous system asking for right now? And then listen, and you might be surprised by the answer, because your body has probably been trying to tell you for quite some time. And remember, every time you pause, every time you notice, every time you choose curiosity over criticism, every time you meet yourself with compassion, every time you breathe gently, calmly, you are teaching your nervous system something incredibly important. You're teaching it that safety is possible, one gentle breath at a time, one moment at a time, until eventually safety starts becoming familiar. And that's when you stop spending all your energy trying to survive your life and you can actually begin living it. And of course, there will be challenges, but you're living it with a steadiness that comes from knowing you can always find your way back to yourself, back to your breath, back to your body, and back to a sense of harmony. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I would absolutely love to hear what you've taken from it. Has it resonated? Is it helpful? Even share with me your experiences of anxiety. I just think sometimes when we talk about it, when we face it, and we can move through it to help us really live a life which feels a little lighter and a little brighter. Thank you so much for listening today, and I can't wait to speak to you next time. Take care. Bye. Before you go, just to let you know that you'll find a selection of gentle, practical offers at really accessible prices over on my website. They're all designed to support your everyday breathing, to ease anxiety and help you build a more resilient, flexible nervous system so you can feel calmer and bring a little more steadiness into your daily life. Everything I share is designed to meet you where you are and to fit into real busy lives. Just go to hollywarren.com and click on the resource library. If you'd like to stay connected between episodes, you can also find me over on Instagram at Polly Warren Coaching. This is where I share simple reminders and tools and reflections to help you come back to calm throughout the week. And if you're enjoying Take a Breath, it would mean so much if you could take a moment to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help this podcast reach more women who might need a little space to breathe too. Thank you so much for being here and for taking this time for yourself. And remember, sometimes all you need to do is take a breath.